And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, January 9th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, ever tried fixing your own car? The right to repair fight is heating up as costs soar and Congress weighs a new national law. Plus, the latest shutdown exposed real problems in how Washington funds Indian country. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Office of Personnel Management is out with new guidance on telework and remote work for federal employees. The updated policy now emphasizes as much in-person presence as possible across government. OPM's revisions aim to better align with the Trump administration's return to office orders. Here with more details is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Nice to be with you as always, Terry.
All right, we have more formal guidance. What does this new guidance say about in-person work expectations?
Well, there won't be a lot of surprises here for federal employees. Essentially, what the Office of Personnel Management is saying is that they should be fully on site, essentially as much as possible, with a few exemptions that we can get into later. But federal employees should generally be working full-time in person. And of course, this comes back to an executive order that President Trump issued on his first day in office, which told agencies to cancel all telework and remote work agreements and return employees to the office full-time. That's, of course, been a point of contention and debate for many years, really starting with the COVID-19 pandemic and kind of the future of work as we came out of that. There was some back and forth, of course, during the Biden administration, but now we've seen this real push towards just fully on-site presence without a whole lot of exemptions there.
You did mention that there would be some exemptions or some exceptions. Where is telework or remote work still at least technically allowed?
There are exceptions for federal employees. For example, if you have a disability or if you are a military spouse, there's exemptions there. And it's really as long as that doesn't diminish the performance of the employees. So OPM in its new guidance talked about, the ability to telework or work remotely is okay as long as the employee is continuing to perform at the same level. But as we've seen in practice, there have been some employees who have said that they've actually been denied reasonable accommodation requests to telework, even if they do have a qualifying disability. So there are some concerns there about the implementation of that part of the policy. For example, at the Department of Health and Human Services, they launched during 2025 a stricter review process for approving those accommodations, which slowed things down, and agencies like the CDC backtracked on some of their approvals. So there's a lot of complications in the actual implementation, again, as I mentioned, but it's something where generally OPM is saying that agencies have the discretion to allow those reasonable accommodations. They should be granted on a case-by-case basis, while at the same time emphasizing that those should be used sparingly and that telework should really just be not a very common practice for federal employees.
Do you think now that the guidance is out, that will help agencies who were in that sort of reconsideration of reasonable accommodation?
It's possible. I think we may see more clarifications from OPM over time, but it's, in the way things are operating right now, some federal employees who have struggled with this may be able to go back to the guidance to look for more details or more ways to work with their agency on that. But, it's unclear with this guidance being so recent how it's going to look in practice and how much it's really going to change things. It seems to be more of a reflection of what was already in place rather than something that is truly changed for federal employees.
Got it. The return to office executive order was one that came out very early in the Trump administration. Do they have data now about what in-office rates are like?
There was a recent blog post from OPM Director Scott Cooper where he reported that around 90% of federal employees were working on-site full-time. And that number is an increase from what we saw during the Biden administration. The numbers and the way those things are measured is a little bit unclear. You can look at, timesheets, but there's always been this question of how accurate that data is for how federal employees are teleworking. And, agencies measure things differently. But generally, there, of course, has been an increase in on-site presence since the Trump administration began. With that 90%, as Director Cooper reported, that leaves about 10% of federal employees who would have then been given an exemption from those on-site requirements, been able to telework or work remotely. And again, going back to those couple of reasons where it's due to a disability or some other really compelling reason that an agency can approve. But again, generally, it's going to be very much in the office presence right now.
Drew, the argument between being on-site in the office and being able to work hybrid has kind of been a football for years, even before COVID. What is the Trump administration's argument in favor of bringing everyone back into the office?
Some of the things, going back again to Director Cooper's recent blog post, he talks about how workplace culture suffers when people aren't in the office. There's not as clear communication or collaboration. He talked about how strong connections are formed with in-person presence, and especially for maybe those who are new hires or just starting their federal careers, they might need more on-site presence for training, for mentoring, things like that. And just the fact that connections are harder to build virtually. Those are sort of the arguments that have been made in favor of on-site work. Over time, there have been a little bit stronger criticisms as well of telework, where you've had, for example, House Republicans saying that they believed federal employees who were working from home are not working. That's obviously been pushed back against very strongly by federal employees themselves and a lot of supporters of the federal workforce who say there are very clear monitoring mechanisms to be able to tell that federal employees are indeed working from home, and many do say that they are more productive working from home as well.
So what is the flip side of the argument then at this stage for proponents of hybrid work?
Right. Well, the one that I mentioned, of course, is that productivity and performance are better when there is that flexibility in employees' schedules. They say that they feel like there's fewer distractions at home and that they're able to focus on their work without having the commute time. They say that they're able to put in sometimes longer hours and work more effectively that way. Others, look more broadly at how this impacts the federal workforce as a whole and say that it really helps with recruitment and retention and can be a driving force for someone to take a job if they see that there's going to be some flexibility in that regard. They also say there's not really necessarily a decrease in collaboration or connection because there are so many ways to connect virtually as well. So, as you mentioned, this is something that's gone back and forth for many, many years. The arguments for and against the COVID-19 pandemic obviously heightened that argument. And, I think now we're in another new phase of what that work really looks like. But at least for the time being, it seems like end of the day, federal employees are expected to just simply be in person almost entirely.
Drew, one of the other big initiatives from the Trump administration was the downsizing of the federal building footprint. And a lot of folks have argued that hybrid work or remote work is one way to make that more possible. How is the administration connecting those two dots, or are they?
It seems like they are connecting those two dots. They're trying to look at both scaling that down, but also returning people to the office. It's a little bit unclear on how that kind of matches up with those two mindsets. But certainly if you look at GSA, the General Services Administration, that's something they have tried to do to reduce office space. But, on the flip side, especially when we first heard about the return to office last year, a lot of federal employees were saying that things were just way too packed. There were conference rooms full of people. They were out of office supplies a lot of the time. So it's definitely been a bit of a stretch and a bit of a challenge, absolutely, for federal employees who have been told to come back to work full time.
So does it feel like now that this policy is out, that that's the end of the argument for the Trump administration? We're not revisiting it. Here's the rule.
It seems to be the case, at least for the rest of this administration. Return to office has not really come into question as much as it has in past years when there was more openness to hybrid work. So now it seems like moving forward, at least for the next couple of years, federal employees should just be expected to work in the office, again, unless they have some sort of exemption, which agencies are supposed to be approving as needed.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for bringing us the clarity on this important issue.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the latest shutdown exposed real problems in how Washington funds Indian country. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The federal government's oldest legal obligations to provide health, education, and economic support for tribal nations remain chronically underfunded and uniquely vulnerable to shutdowns. A new Brookings analysis argues Congress should shift more Native American funding to mandatory spending to protect treaty commitments. Here with more details is the report's author, Brookings Fellow Robert Maxim. Mr. Maxim, thank you for joining me today.
Great to be with you.
You've written a recent report that hits on the impact of how we fund Indian country, and especially how the shutdown brought to light some of the faults in that system. Talk to us a little bit about why the tribes are so vulnerable when the federal government shuts down.
Yeah, I think it's important just to start by helping folks understand the context of funding for Indian country. So unlike other groups in the U.S., funding for Indian country isn't based on race or need. It's based on these treaties that the U.S. signed with tribes, over 400 treaties which have been reaffirmed by court cases and federal law. And so funding for tribes, tribal citizens, and tribal communities really looks different than other groups in the U.S. in that it is arguably the U.S.'s oldest legal obligation. But despite this kind of perpetual legal obligation that the U.S. has to tribes, we fund tribes out of typical discretionary funding. So when a shutdown happens, when a Congress fails to pass an appropriations bill each year, a large portion of the funding to Indian country halts, despite the fact that it's still owed as a legal obligation.
Your paper makes a point of the size of the gap. Walk us through the treaty obligations for funding and how much we actually send in that direction.
Yeah, so Congress appropriates about $37 billion every year for tribal programs. And actually, you can argue that that is quite a low number compared to what the U.S. may owe for tribes as part of their tribal obligations. So just to give you an example, the federal government appropriates about $7 billion every year for the Indian Health Service, which is the primary health care service provider for many Native people in the U.S. But estimates by tribal leaders put the full amount owed on an annual basis closer to $70 billion. So in some areas, the federal government may be appropriating only about 1/10 of what it actually owes to tribal communities.
And where does the rest of the funding come from then, or is that all there is?
In many cases, that's kind of all there is. So let me give you an example. With IHS, Indian Health Service spends about $4,000 per patient each year. Compare that to other federal health expenditure programs. So Medicaid is closer to $8,000, so twice what IHS spends. The Veterans Affairs Department spends closer to $16,000, and Medicare spends actually almost $17,000 per patient. So you see these really wide gaps in the amount of funding available for Indian country compared to other communities. And a large part of it is because of this funding structure.
And what did the shutdown show about the real weaknesses in this process? Not only are they underfunded, but there's some other structural shortcomings.
Yeah, that's right. And so one of the biggest is this idea of, I mentioned it earlier, discretionary funding. And so what that means, and I'm sure Federal News Network listeners probably know this, but just as a background, there's really broadly two types of spending in the U.S., right? There's discretionary spending, which is at the discretion of Congress each year, and they can choose what to fund and how much to fund it. And then there's mandatory funding, which is funding that's kind of set on autopilot each year. So think about Social Security or Medicare. And it's a bit more complex than that, but those are the kind of general categories. The vast majority of spending for Indian country actually comes out of this discretionary pot. And so what that means is if the federal government hasn't passed a spending bill by the end of the fiscal year on September 30th, all of that funding to Indian country, to tribes, to help the governments operate, for many of the key programs that support Native people, it halts. And so you saw that this year during the government shutdown, there were many key programs for federal government that the federal government provides to tribal government agencies that weren't able to operate.
I'm speaking with Robert Maxim. He's a fellow at the Brookings Institution. One of the other programs that really helps Indian country is SNAP, the Supplemental Food Program. And we heard so much during the shutdown about how that was impacted. How did that play out in the tribal lands?
Yeah, so it's important to remember that there are a lot of low-income people in Indian country. And so Native people use SNAP benefits, use food stamps at one of the highest rates of any group in the United States. And so there was absolutely a disproportionate impact on tribal communities when those benefits halted. And so that's, again, not to get too into the weeds, but I think helpful to illustrate. That's a really good example of one of those really kind of unique programs that exist in the U.S. SNAP is technically a mandatory program. If you're eligible, you can get as many benefits as you're entitled to. But it is what's called an appropriated entitlement. And so that means if Congress hasn't passed an appropriations for SNAP by the end of the fiscal year, it's very unclear whether it can operate. And that was a big legal test during the shutdown that didn't get resolved. And so what happened is there were a significant number of Native people that lost access to food support. And how did tribes go about navigating that? Some of them operated their own programs. There were some tribes that had resources available through things like gaming that were able to kind of pick up the slack in the absence of the federal government. But that's not every tribe, right? Other tribes leaned on traditional ways of hunting and farming and really utilized kind of a community focus. You saw stories of tribes that had, distribution of meat that they had hunted and brought in. And so there were really this kind of, I think, sense of leaning on community that happened in many tribal communities across the U.S., again, because of this disproportionate number of Native people that were affected by the SNAP benefits.
And so what recommendations do you make and to reform the system, improve it, make sure that we're meeting our obligations?
Yeah, we really have two broad recommendations in the piece. So the first is a short-term recommendation. And what we say is we really need to get all of this funding for Indian country out of the discretionary pot. And one of the things we recommend doing in the short run is converting appropriations for Indian country into what are called advance appropriations. So what that means is you get your kind of pot of money for the fiscal year, but then in advance, Congress authorizes you to spend a certain amount the following year. So that's already done in one area of funding for tribal communities, for the Bureau of Indian Education and for the for the Indian Health Service. Indian Health Service in particular has these advance appropriations. And so what that meant is when the fiscal year lapsed, last year Congress had already said you can spend, $1 billion in FY26. And so when this new fiscal year started, because last year Congress had said you can spend this money, IHS was able to continue operating. And so what that meant is, despite the many imperfections with that system that I outlined earlier, it was still able to offer healthcare for Native people. And so we argue in the piece that should be kind of the baseline in the short run for any program funding Indian country. And then in the longer term, we say that the federal government should shift more funding for Indian country to this mandatory spending. So make it look more like Social Security or Medicare than it does currently. And again, just to give you a sense of why that matters, not only would that prevent funding from being impacted by the shutdown, but think about those spending levels that I talked about earlier. If you shifted programs like IHS to operate more like Medicare, it would allow Native people to access the full suite of benefits that they need and really that the federal government is obligated to provide, rather than this kind of shortened and moderated version that they have now.
What's your sense of support for those recommendations on the Hill?
Well, the exciting thing was shortly after we published this piece, the Senate Indian Affairs Committee held a hearing on the issue of how the government shutdown was impacting Indian country. And at that hearing, really a bipartisan group of senators, led actually by Republican Chair Lisa Murkowski, said that perhaps it's time to begin thinking about how we reform how the federal government funds Indian country and funds its obligations to tribal nations. And so she was quite supportive of this idea. She cited actually our report by name at that hearing. And so I'm actually quite enthusiastic that there is the opportunity for this to transcend partisan boundaries. The challenge, I think, for this, as it is with so many things in Indian country, is that people don't know about it and people don't think about it. There are a lot of folks that don't know many Native people, and so Native issues just aren't on their radar. And I think you see that a bit in Congress, too. And so we're hoping that not only is this something that, Congress will think about and move forward on a bipartisan basis, but also that they can increase awareness of among different members.
Well, we may be able to see if there's progress on the understanding level in January.
Yeah, well, let's hope we're not heading back to another shutdown then.
I've been speaking with Robert Maxim. He's a fellow at the Brookings Institution. Thank you so much for joining me, and thanks for this insight.
Yeah, and thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview and a link to the paper at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the State Department gave its acquisition office an even bigger seat at the leadership table. Former state senior procurement executive Mike Darios tells us how. But first, if you've ever tried fixing your car, you know the right to repair fight is heating up as costs soar and Congress weighs a national law. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Despite strong bipartisan support and rising repair costs, right to repair provisions were stripped from the NDAA. Now all eyes are on the Repair Act as lawmakers debate whether Americans should control how and where they fix their own vehicles. Justin Rzepka, Executive Director of the Consumer Access to Repair Coalition, is here to break down what's at stake. Mr. Rzepka, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
The right to repair is a topic we've talked about on this show many times related to defense equipment, but it's a movement that's gaining traction across the country and certainly within the Trump administration. Why do you think there's so much public interest in advancing right to repair equipment?
Yeah, it's a great question, Terry. And I think that the issue that I focus on is automotive right to repair. And I think the reason why it comes up so much with the American public is because of the cost issue, right? Everyone knows, costs are rising, and auto repair costs are rising specifically so much higher and quicker than all other costs. And so I think that's why it's resonating with people, because it's coming directly out of their pocketbooks.
And so back to my defense question for a minute. People really thought that the right to repair was a guaranteed provision in the NDAA, and it did not make it in. What does that tell you about maybe the strength of the industry lobbyists and the challenge that even automotive right to repair might face when it comes to getting statutory coverage in Washington?
Yeah, Terry, the Warrior Right to Repair Act was, widely supported, by both parties. When Senator Tim Sheehy of Montana and Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts agree on something, right, that this is a special case. And so it did not make it in the final product. That's sort of part of the sausage making here in Washington. But I do think that there is such momentum here that they will take another run at it at next year's NDAA. And again, to answer your question, I think that really just speaks to how the vested interests in preventing sort of right to repair on a whole host of issues, including autos, are going to make it very challenging, for the folks to win on this. I do think, this consumer issue is on our side on this, and I think will ultimately prevail. But the opposition is strong, as reflected in Warrior Right to Repair.
Well, as you said, your organization is specifically focused on the individual's right to repair their own automobiles. Tell us more about what's really at stake here. How did the lack of national right to repair laws affect individuals' costs, choices, and maybe even safety?
Yeah, Terry. So the Consumer Access to Repair Coalition, or CAR Coalition, where I'm the executive director, our mission is to lower the cost of auto repairs, and we think a national standard is really what's needed. There's been a long history of auto right to repair in the United States. People, popping the hood on their own car, getting that fixed. We think that's been eroding, and that's due to some technological issues. Nowadays your car, again, in a good way, right? It's safer, it lasts longer. Those are all really good things, but they're becoming harder to repair because of the technological sophistication of the cars. There's a piece of legislation that Dr. Dunn of Florida has introduced, and it simply empowers car owners to have access to information in order to get their car repaired. This is information that they need to fix it, diagnose information, repair information, things like that. That's all the bill does. Basically, it allows the consumer to make a choice if they want to fix it themselves, take it to the local mechanic down the street, or to the dealership. And those things have been eroded over time due to technological barriers. And we think this legislation is needed. And states like Massachusetts and Maine already have state laws on the books, and we think those are great. But driving your car around the country, you shouldn't have to go through different state laws. So we think one national standard is the appropriate vehicle here.
Would you be concerned about safety, automobile safety, if individuals are doing their own repairs?
Absolutely not, Terry. Safety is paramount for everyone, right? Nobody wants to support a piece of legislation where safety is in question. You know, for 70, 80 years, people have been able to fix their cars at their house or at the local mechanic, and there's never been any safety issues or liability issues with those repairs, right? The car companies have no issue with it now, and this won't change anything. All we're doing is maintaining the right of the car owners to make their decisions. You know, unfortunately, right now, there's really not much of a choice with newer cars. You can either take it back to the dealership, and that's really the only choice you have. We want to keep those choices, your local mechanic, or again, if you're a gearhead and you want to fix your own car, we think that also should remain an option for the American car owner.
I'm speaking with Justin Rzepka. He is Executive Director of the Consumer Access to Repair Coalition. Well, talk to me a little bit more about the rising costs of automotive repair. Your group makes the contention that limiting repair options actually contributes to rising costs. So how would you go about reversing that trend?
Yeah. Well, I'm not an economist, but I think, we all know that when there's less choice, right, prices go up. And so over the last 5 years, Terry, general inflation is up about 20%. Those are numbers from the BLS, and they change, up and down all the time, but that's a general number. Auto repair costs have gone up 53% in those same 5 years. So we're talking over a 30% delta in the cost increase in auto repairs. And we just don't think that's tied to inflation. We think there's a couple things. There's lack of parts availability, right? Car companies and others restricting what parts the public can and can't buy, as well as restricting this access to vehicle data. That's the bill that I talked about, the Repair Act, where, back in the day, you could pop open the hood, you could visualize what's wrong. You used to be able to plug in a tool and sort of get information. Now, this information is being transmitted wirelessly, and a car owner who spends more than $50,000 on average for a new car today doesn't have access to that information. And when you don't have access, you don't have choice. And when you don't have choice, costs go up.
It seems like the Federal Trade Commission and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration are involved in this. What kind of position are they taking on right to repair?
Yeah, so in a bipartisan, unanimous way, the FTC, both Republican and Democratic commissioners have weighed in on right to repair issues. They published a seminal report called Nixing the Fix, where they talked about a lot of industries and specifically the automotive industry. They talked a lot about having lack of access to this information can drive up costs. The GAO, Terry, has done reports on this. The Congressional Research Service has done work on this. As recently as June of 2025, Commissioner Mark Meador of the FTC talked about right to repair issues. And then Administrator Jonathan Morrison at NHTSA also talked about auto right to repair and what a critical this issue is and how consumers having access to information is really important to make sure they can get their vehicles repaired.
The issue really goes beyond automobiles even. It's consumer electronics, it's home appliances, it's all kinds of things out there. How does your effort here in automotive right to repair extend to other sectors?
Yeah, Terry, we're really happy to see that rising tide lifts all boats. When I started working on this issue almost 6 years ago, you had to really kind of explain what right to repair was, or sort of how the consumer owns a product and they should be able to fix it how they want. And through the years, because of, like you mentioned, Terry, cell phones and dishwashers, things like that, more and more Americans are starting to understand the right to repair issues and their lack of ability to fix these issues. What I would differentiate on automotive issues, Terry, is if you break your cell phone, or your washing machine goes on the fritz, that's really unfortunate, and that's not a small expense. But you know what? You can go out and replace those. An auto repair cost, the average repair costs are over $5,000, $6,000. This is a critical thing in most people's lives, right? Besides their house, this is the most expensive thing that an American will buy. And so you've got to take your kids to school, you've got to buy groceries, you have to drive to work. This isn't something that can be easily replaced. Your car needs to be able to be fixed affordably and reliably. And that's why we think this is a special issue among the right to repair issues.
One of the concerns that I've heard is that individuals repairing their own equipment will violate the manufacturer's warranty. Any provisions for protecting that kind of warranty coverage if somebody, breaks a screw or misconnects a cable?
There are already laws on the books like the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act that protect warranties. And what I would say, Terry, is that if you don't really control something, do you really have ownership over it? So the average price of a new car in America is more than $50,000. And if you drive that car off the lot and you don't have the ability to fix that car because of lack of information, do you really own that car? If we want to have a discussion in America about a lease or a rent model or as a service model, that's something to discuss. But right now, if you own something, you should be able to do what you want with it when you want with it. And so, I fundamentally reject those arguments. And again, we're talking about repair and maintenance information. We're not talking about other parts of the car or proprietary softwares. We're talking about the ability for a car owner to get their car fixed how they want to, where they want to, and their choice.
So what should people be watching for as this conversation moves forward in 2026?
Yeah, well, our understanding, Terry, is that the Energy and Commerce Committee is going to have a hearing next week on auto issues, and we are understanding that Dr. Dunn's bill, the Repair Act, HR 1566, will be considered. So there's going to be a great opportunity for the American public to tune in and watch Congress do what they're supposed to do, which is discuss possible legislation and talk about the merits of the bills and how it affects consumers. So that's going to be a huge opportunity for, pro right to repair advocates to weigh in and talk to their members of Congress on why this issue is important and why it's something that Congress should consider. So, we expect that hearing to be next week, and we're really excited about it, Terry.
I've been speaking with Justin Rezepka. He's Executive Director of the Consumer Access to Repair Coalition. Thanks so much for joining me today.
It was my pleasure, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, the State Department gave its acquisition office an even bigger seat at the leadership table. Former State Senior Procurement Executive Mike Darios tells us how. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The State Department didn't just rename its procurement office as part of its reorganization. The new Bureau of Global Acquisitions is no longer buried inside the agency. For more on why this new name and elevated status matter, Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller, talked to Mike Darios, a former senior procurement executive at State, and now the new executive director of the Baroni Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University.
We set an ambitious course for ourselves to enact some significant change, rolled our sleeves up, and we executed. And, my leadership approach has always been galvanize people behind a vision and then challenge them to go beyond their own perceived limitations in pursuit of it. And that's exactly what that staff did. That is why that organization was elevated to be a bureau finally. Doing things to actually think about how the business is functioning, not just how many contracts are we getting out there, but, how well are we doing that work? How are we adding value to mission support? Are we thinking about how we're improving our way of doing business and offering service to the customers, putting balanced scorecards in place, robust human capital plans, moving to a category management model. I mean, all of those things were just, that was swinging for the fences, and they were up for it and they did it. And I'm really proud of that work.
Let me start backwards with this idea of elevating acquisition to your bureau level. What does that really mean? So previously it was an office, now it's a bureau, but what's the difference?
A lot of people don't understand the organizational alignment, within government structures. And the reason it's important is because when procurement is buried in an organization, like it kind of was at state for a while, you miss the leadership. The executive leadership misses the opportunity to get very important information that I think informs enterprise level decisions. How you spend an agency's money, what you're spending it on, how you're defining those requirements, how well you're working with industry, again, to get to those outcomes that you're outsourcing for. And what are you learning from that? What data do you have available that can inform our thinking about, other things? I mean, times are tough financially for agencies. And, the more data that an acquisition line of business can offer and bring to the table to, again, get the executive roundtable, if you will, to think about things holistically, in terms of where they want to invest their money, what went well previously in terms of a contracting effort and what didn't, where we need to be managing risk, differently. All of that is just incredibly valuable perspective that I don't think is always leveraged if the voice can't be heard. And so it's really just about getting that important seat at the table. Your acquisition function should be at the same table as the budget function, as the CIO, as any other very important mission support function, because all of it is aggregated. All of it, there's slivers of mission being done by all of those organizations, and you have to have a holistic conversation, not just in pockets.
When did this exactly happen? Was it at the end of the fiscal year, sometime earlier this year when it became a bureau? And does it have a new name now?
Yeah, other than Bureau of Global Acquisitions, they just put Bureau in front of it. And it was started as a result of the big State Department reorg that was announced earlier in the year. So the planning really went into, I'd say I've been planning for it for 5 years. We were working hard on a business case to make make that move at some point, and it just so happened that the political leadership thought it was a good idea and baked it into the overall reorg plans that they announced earlier this calendar year. And so we spent much of the summer doing the work that it would take to actually make the move up to the bureau level. And it went into effect right at the end of the fiscal year.
All right, look at that. Just a little bit of news. I hadn't heard that. I don't know if we saw that change. There's no press release that came out per se, so appreciate the little bit of heads up. Does becoming a bureau mean, you mentioned the seat at the table, to be able to influence and educate senior leaders? Does it come with more people, more money? Did you bring in other organizations? Is this a centralized procurement function, or is this really at that high policy level that still now oversees kind of the contracting officers in consular affairs or contracting officers in diplomatic security or wherever they are?
Yeah, there was definitely a push to centralize much of the procurement that was not happening within that office. So some of the functions were supposed to be folding in to kind of create better economy of effort. That was a piece of it. Just going back to your question about money and people, no. I mean, right now every agency is looking to cut cost. And so there wasn't necessarily, additional people attached to it, but we did look at where was there contracting work that needed to be brought under the umbrella. Were there people that were in the 1102 series that, should be doing or were doing organic contracting work and should be, brought under the organization. And so in those cases, we made arrangements to try to make moves. I wouldn't say that it came with any additional funding. Procurement at state is actually very unique. It's a working capital fund. And so the entire operation runs on a fee-for-service apparatus. I hope at some point there is consideration for the fee to possibly increase, because I think that it's going to be needed in the future to just keep up with, general growth.
You got ahead of me. That was probably one of my other questions. What's on the to-do list for the next senior procurement executive? So we'll put that in the back of our mind and come back to it. When you talk about becoming a bureau, You mentioned some other related efforts that I think are important to that kind of fall into this. You mentioned, for instance, the move to category management. You mentioned robust human capital plans. You mentioned a few other things. Balanced scorecards is another example. Walk me through some of those efforts. What did you do? Let's start with category management. It's a big push from this administration. It's been a big push from the last several administrations, really, to change the way agencies are buying. How did you use category management to change the way the state buys goods and services?
Going back to that comment you just made about, what should the next SPE at State Department be thinking about? I think it is squarely category management. So we worked for about 3 years to put a new model in place for service delivery. And it was all based on how we were spending State Department's budget. So we did some pretty heavy analytic work to realize that about 80% of the money was being spent in 4 major categories. So when you look at all the product service codes that we were obligating money on, they all fell in 4 big buckets, frankly. And so it just made sense for us to start to move in that direction in terms of how we were organized to service the category, if you will. And that gives us the opportunity to really look at the requirements in 2 different ways. Real time. So are there opportunities with all the buyers kind of centralized around, let's just say, IT and professional services, right? Let's just consider those 2 different categories. With all of our buyers kind of building up deep market insight in those respective areas, because those are very unique types of contracting activity, well, they're able to put better acquisition strategies in place, right? And if the work is flowing into the organization in terms of a category model, well, it gives us the opportunity to put a lens on the work in real time to figure out, hey, do we have 20 customers all buying the same thing right now? Well, if so, let's aggregate that demand before we go to market.
Mike Darios is a former senior procurement executive at the State Department and the new executive director of the Baroni Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University, speaking there with Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Up next, the top national headlines from CBS News and the Federal Newscast. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.